Hello, friends. My name is Steve, and welcome to the Friday Conversation, episode 85. Thank you for coming by. Hope everyone is having a fantastic week. And if you'd like to join us on any Friday Conversation, you can check out our forums at pagechewing.com and let us know you want to join us. So it's a great little community there. So we're very excited to have author Josh Erikson this week. Josh, will you kick us off with introductions, please?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I'm Josh Erikson. I'm the writer and narrator of the urban fantasy series Ethereal Earth. And I'm just a big fan of talking about books in general, so I'm glad to be here.
Nice, good to have you. And Paromita's up late or early, I guess, with us.
Hello, everyone. I'm Paromita. I'm a member of the Page Chewing Forum, and I'm very happy to be part of this episode. Thank you.
Of course, glad you can make it. They know it's late for you. And Jose.
Yeah, hi, I'm Jose. I run the Jose's Amazing Worlds channel on YouTube. I can also be found lurking around pagechewing.com. And I'm very happy and excited to be here. Thank you.
Glad you can make it. It's always great to have you. So Paramita had some urban fantasy questions. I'll let you kick it off, Paramita.
Okay, thank you.
You have the best questions, so I don't want to stop you. Just get out of your way.
Mr. Erikson, I had the opportunity to look at your website and your books, and I was just thinking a little bit about what we could discuss, and I wanted to ask you a little about this subgenre that you chose to write in. Is it, and the process of creating immersion, is it a bit different or a bit difficult from, let's say, secondary world epic fantasy, where you have a totally different world which is created by the author and they can do what they want, whereas with urban fantasy, especially if it's in a real city setting, there might be certain restrictions. So just your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. But I think there are pros and cons to both. So in a secondary world, you're doing all of the world building on your own. You know, when you go into a pure fantasy, like an epic fantasy book, you're brand new to the world. Whereas in urban fantasy, you have a lot of groundwork already laid for you. So it's a little bit lazy in that respect, but then you're also playing with all the real world restrictions too. You know, it's one of the big things that you run into in urban fantasy that wasn't such a big problem like 15, 20 years ago, is that everybody has a cell phone now. And so a lot of the plot contrivances that you used to be able to get away with, you can't anymore, because everybody has a map, a computer in their pocket that they can find the answer to everything instantly. And you have to deal with that in your story in a believable way. You know, you can't always break the cell phone or have no signal. You have to work that in. So I think there are pros and cons to both. I love both genres. I just, for whatever reason, this story fell into a urban setting for me when it popped into my head.
I think that's the same problem that horror movies have, is the cell phone.
Yeah.
Like, they have to somehow make it so they don't have a signal, or it gets broken or gets lost. They can't get lost in the woods anymore. Everyone has a phone to call for help. Nothing's
scary when you can call an Uber within 5 seconds and just get away from wherever you are. So you have to get rid of some of those modern conveniences.
Definitely.
Yeah, because I've noticed... Oh, sorry, Paramita, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
I'm not very well read in urban fantasy, but I was thinking a bit about the settings of some of the popular series. For example, Rivers of London by Ben Aronovich, or The Dresden Files, for example, which is set in Chicago, and lots of others. So one thing I was thinking about is a lot of these city settings, they tend to be multicultural settings. For example, London, of course, is a melting pot of cultures, and then even Chicago, I mean, the United States in general is a melting pot of cultures. Do you think that that's a deliberate authorial choice? Because when they have to introduce the mythological creatures, for example, it sort of makes more sense in that there are people from different places and cultures and their beliefs. And so there's sort of this American gods Neil Gaiman idea that their myths and their beliefs traveled with them. And so it is not immersion breaking to have those mythological creatures residing, for example. Just wanted to ask your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I love that. I love that question because I was reading American Gods when the idea for this series came into my head, and so one of the central conceits of my series is that all the myths and legends that are in the world are actually from human belief. You know, they're not really naturally occurring. There's this kind of spirit. Kind of a stem cell like entity called an umbra that can take on the beliefs and soaks up those myths and legends and things, and then becomes that, and then they manifest in the world that way. And so I love doing a lot of the research on the actual myths, and not just the comic book versions, but like the real things in the world, and some of the ways they interact with the different cultures, and then injecting little fun tidbits in the books for the people who either already know that or care enough to go look it up after the fact. Sometimes it's just a throwaway joke, and sometimes it's something really core to the story, but I think that's one of the really great things about urban fantasy is that you can do that, and you can not only draw from all that, but then you can also introduce people to some of these other cultural touchstones and these like rich historical backgrounds that they may not have otherwise been introduced to, and then they get. I have one character that's a Pishtaco, that's a South American legend, and one of my first readers came back to me and said I had never heard of that, and then I went and fell down a rabbit hole when I went to find out what that was. And so it's really neat that you get to do that and kind of introduce people and then pay a little bit of honor to some of those legends too.
So really sorry. So I haven't read your books. I'm browsing through your website. You live in Nebraska. Where is your series set? Is it?
Yeah, it's actually set
in your hometown, somewhere that you know well?
Yeah, it's actually set in Lincoln, Nebraska, which is the capital of Nebraska. It's not. I mean, it is technically urban, but the first book is in Lincoln, and it's like 150,000 people-ish, so it's nothing like Chicago or London.
No, but so like, because my line of questioning was more like, was that a conscious decision? Because like I've written some short stories myself, and I base them in my hometown, because if I'm going to write about a town, like I really want to know full well that you can go down that road, and that you can take a left there, or you cannot take a right in that road. Because if someone from Lincoln was to read that book, and you came up with like a wrong location, or a sort of, there's always that fear that someone local may trip you up and catch you out.
Yep, exactly. I know. I always used to laugh at the authors who took trips to Rome or whatever to do research for their book, quote unquote. But you really do need that. You need the verisimilitude of knowing the real place. And so my second book starts to become more globe-trotting. And so I had to devote, locations in China and things like that. I had to devote a lot of time just to reading books and doing research on the area, so that when I said they take a left down this street, that street exists, and that hospital is where I say it is.
Sounds like a lot too, especially for a town that you're not too familiar with. It'd be a lot of. Is it like Google Maps, or what would you use to?
A little bit of everything, Google Maps, and a lot of like TripAdvisor things. You can get a lot of on-site feedback from different locations, and I mean, just any way you can. I always joke that my Google search algorithm is just absolutely ruined. Google has no idea who I am. As far as they know, I'm in the market to buy a yacht, and I'm an international businessman, and I'm interested in swords and the weight of a human head, you know.
So they're watching you, in other words, right?
My FBI agent is busy, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was going to ask something. So you said you're a mythology nerd. Is that fair
Yeah.
too?
Absolutely,
And
yeah.
you love to read books. So I want to ask maybe two questions, if the other panelists don't mind. One is, which I ask everyone. You can ask the other panelists some favorite books of yours, if you please share with us. And the second one is, what was that moment for you when you realized that you have a story to tell, that it cannot just be reading anymore. It's time to get writing your own story for us to read.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you always have that moment. My favorite books, actually, I have a shelf of them right behind me of my favorites, and it's American Gods, and that's the one that inspired my series. And I've got Tolkien back there, and George R. R. Martin, and Edgar Allan Poe, and Khalil Gibran, and just a lot of different influences that are either I like it for the prose or I like it for the story. But picking just one is impossible for a true book lover. But I think for me, the moment that I realized that I wanted to tell a story was when I read a really bad one. It wasn't, I was reading American Gods, and then I moved on to something else. I won't, out the book. But I was reading it, and I just absolutely couldn't understand. It was published by a traditional publisher, and it had tons of good reviews, and it just absolutely fell flat for me. And there were every chapter, I would find 5 or 6 things that I would have done differently. And eventually I said, well, then if you're so good, then do it, if you think you know so much. So I had to, prove to myself that I wasn't just, making stuff up. And then I got carried away and wrote 5 books.
So, because by the sounds of it, obviously you mentioned it a couple of times, American Gods. I mean, I think the idea behind it was quite striking, and I think quite significant. I mean, the underpinning that sort of beliefs just give power to the gods is an old one, and it's something that he shared with Terry Pratchett, and other people have sort of replicated over time. But that notion of people bringing their beliefs with them and making them happen, is that something that you've also incorporated into your series?
Yeah. That's nothing's ever new. It's just a reworked version of something that inspired from the previous generation. So yeah, I definitely took that concept and kind of made it my own and turned it into another thing. But that was powerful to me. That I grew up thinking of faith as kind of this ephemeral thing that was it was an obligation, it didn't really have any inherent power. And so I loved the idea of faith and belief having this passive, very tangible power that could go on to feed these incredible things that we may not even know exist in the background. I like the idea that there's a spark of creation in everybody, and that we don't necessarily know how much our passion and excitement for things is going on to help bring them into the world.
Yeah, and so I just got like my mind goes. So there's two things. Like, are you familiar with the Department of Truth comic book series?
No.
Which is, it's again, it's like an ongoing series, but it's based on the idea that that belief can shape reality. So there's a Department of Truth in the United States, like the sort of secret branch of government that shapes reality based on, and by disseminating misinformation, they get people to believe in conspiracy theories, and that becomes reality. So I thought, considering what you're talking about...
Are you sure that's a comic book series and not like just actual fact? That seems like a real thing that exists.
I mean, I've got... it's on that bookshelf over there, so I'm pretty certain that's it's a comic book series. But yeah, and also like because again back to that American Gods, like Neil Gaiman, like something that struck me was that he said that the US has got the geography and Europe has got the history. And obviously me being European, like I was born and raised in a town with Roman architecture. There's still a Roman bridge that you can walk over, and we've got Arab castles from the Muslim invasions in the 700s and stuff like that. So as an American, when you're approaching that history, which is so, I mean, what's your impression when when you look at Europe or you look at China, when you're talking about your book, and how do you shape that? How do you cope with that?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I don't want to speak for all Americans, but I think we all kind of approach any place with that much history with kind of a reverence and an awe. And so we ascribe a certain level of, magic to it. I mean, I have a hard time saying goodbye to my old wallet because it's been in my pocket for so long, let alone something that's from 1,000 years ago. So it's, I think Americans especially, and I know it's not just America, but we're a very disposable culture. We think places that have 20 years of history are really, really old. You'll see stores here that says established 2001. Like that's something impressive. Whereas you guys have a pub that was open like at the dawn of time, so it's totally different. And I think we do have a tendency in America to give kind of a magical aura to anything from cultures that are older than ours, which is just about every culture. So we've got a lot to choose from.
No, I just think like the concept of a castle. Like, surely there's no castles in the US, right?
Just styrofoam ones or bouncy ones. Yeah. You can get inflatable castles right now if you want.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah, I don't think there are any castles.
I think there's one in Lincoln that they call a castle. I mean, I suppose you could call it a castle. I think they imported it.
It's a big house.
It's just a very big stone house. But there was never a moat around it, so I don't think it qualifies.
That's something that I'd really like to visit, like a castle. It seems almost like they don't really exist. Like it sounds wild.
Yeah, no kidding.
Is that in your Google history too? Castles?
Oh, I'm sure. If it isn't, it will be. I have several friends. We play D&D, and so occasionally I do have to look up the correct term, for a part of a castle, because I will get called on it if I call a bailiwick something else wrong. So.
Do readers call you out?
I think that's part of the good thing about urban fantasy is a lot of it, they either kind of take your word for it, or if I do get called out on something, it'll be something modern. I had a guy, very nice reader, ask me to please stop calling the magazines for guns clips, because it was a different thing. And he said, just so you know, any gun people are going to know that. And so I changed it from now on because I had no idea. So things like that I do get corrections on, but it's always from people who have read the books and really love them, and so it's always coming from a good place.
Yes.
I
And
thought of
how
a-
do you...
Sorry,
Go
go
ahead,
ahead.
Paromita. I'm sorry. No, go ahead. Go
No,
ahead.
no. Well,
No,
I have a
I
can of
insist.
worms question, so I would like to wait in the backstage for a while you ask
No.
your question.
No, go ahead. Go open the can of worms.
Okay. Urban fantasy versus magical realism.
Yeah, that
What's
is a can
the
of worms.
divide?
I know.
How do we do it? And I still don't understand.
Yeah, I know.
Help me,
I
please.
kind of think of urban fantasy has to have a level of grittiness to it, where magical realism is, it can almost be fantasy adjacent, where it's a secondary world, similar to like Harry Potter, where there's this other thing that exists and it's just a little bit, I don't know, cleaner, shinier, I guess. Whereas urban fantasy has a little bit of dirt on it. But I'm not totally sure that if you asked 10 people, you wouldn't get 10 completely different answers. That's just my perception of it.
I haven't got to 10, but I've tried, I think, like 3 or 4, and it's 3
Yeah.
or 4 wildly divergent opinions.
I know.
I was going to ask you, what do you think about The Ocean at the End of the Lane, which is my favorite book by Neil Gaiman.
Yeah.
And I love that book, but is it urban fantasy? It is
I
set in
know.
the real world.
I know. I kept waiting
It
for
has
something.
that surreal element.
Yeah. You know, it's just I think it's magically beautiful is what it is. I kept waiting for something more incredible to happen, to make it urban fantasy. But it's just a very pretty story.
Yeah.
And Neil Gaiman
Yeah.
kind of gets to do whatever he wants, so he gets a pass. That's fine.
That's
He can
that's
call it
fair.
whatever
I
he
mean,
wants,
it's my
yeah.
favorite. It's my favorite novel by him. And the second
Yeah.
one is Neverwhere.
Oh yeah.
I mean, that is definitely urban fantasy, and I
Yeah.
mean, London Below is probably one of my favorite worlds.
Mm-hmm.
But he announced the sequel, and then he became very much involved in completing Sir Pratchett's vision.
Yeah.
So I respect that. But I'm like, where's my sequel?
Yeah, I know. Yeah, that everything that guy does, as far as I'm concerned, is gold. I was just talking to somebody about his short stories, and I still think about some of those short stories.
I have not read any. Is there
Oh,
a particular one you recommend a lot?
Fragile Things is really good. I think there's more. Smoke and Mirrors maybe is another one. And then he's got quite a few others that, like Snow Glass Apples and A Study in Emerald, I think, is
Okay.
a Sherlock, take. But Smoke and Mirrors and Fragile Things, I think, are my favorite. I hope that's the titles of them. I will get
Thank
called
you
out
so
in your
much.
comments.
I don't know much about magical realism, but to my knowledge, the one author that gets assigned to that category is the Colombian writer Gabriel García Márquez, and 100 Years of Solitude, Love in the Time of the Cholera, and those things are, to me, are as far from fantasy as you can get. It's almost like a fiction with with a touch of the romantic, if you want. But I think they're very, very separate sort of genres. They're to my mind almost with no overlap.
Yeah, no, you're probably a lot closer than I was on that, where magical realism is more. Urban fantasy magic is an integral part of the story, and magical realism, it just kind of flavors the story a little bit.
There's no magic there. There's almost this. There's magic in the sense that I think the characters' deep desires and hopes come true, but not through the means of magic, just through sort of happy happenstance and
What's the
and giving.
is it like Water for Chocolate? I'm remembering 20 years ago. It's the story of a youngest daughter who's in Mexico. It's her job to take care of her mother, and she starts she's making food, and she starts like crying into the food, and it imbues her emotions into it, and people experience those emotions when they eat it. I think I'm remembering that correctly. I'm probably way off, but that's exactly what I think of when I think of magical realism.
Yeah, maybe something like, is it Chocolat by Joanne Harris?
That could be.
No, yeah. This whole, because I remember more the movie than the book.
Yeah.
But again, it's that sort of thing where sort of things are like happy and things are sort of, but very grounded in the real world. But
yeah, exactly. I think that's true.
With a hint of the unbelievable. Everyone is really happy and everyone is almost perfect, sort of thing. Maybe, I don't know.
I agree with you there. Yeah.
And not only so, I also noticed that you narrate your books too.
Yeah.
How long does it take you to narrate a book?
Oh man, so long. When I started doing it, it was, again, go back to Neil Gaiman. This will just be the Neil Gaiman show for you on this episode. I was listening to his stuff and I thought, well, if he can do it, maybe I can try it, give it a shot. It can't be that stupid of me to try. In retrospect, it's not a great idea. It's a pretty big gamble. But it worked. But now, it takes several months to write the book, maybe 6 months. They're pretty long books, 150 to 200,000 words, so decent size. And then the editing process, and then it takes another 2 to 3 months to record it and edit it, and then do all the formatting to get it published. So it's usually a year between books. And in retrospect, man, that's just a really long time. And editing waveform audio is the least amount of fun maybe I've ever had. But you have to do it.
But I have to say, if you're saying 1 year between books, that's a pretty awesome rate.
I love people who think that. Those are my favorite types of people, because that is the rate that I kind of, I'm comfortable with. But now there are people who release a book a month, 2 books a month, and it's just impossible to keep up with.
Nah. They've got ghostwriters. They just have an idea, and they've got a team of ghostwriters. If you're doing a year between books, that's awesome pace.
Yeah, that's...
almost to the point you're bordering on the unnatural.
Well, my last book was I started writing it right when COVID started, and it got really dark, and I had to rewrite the whole thing after about 6 months, and so that one took me about a year and a half. But I released a collection of short stories in that time, so I kind of count it as a year each book, because I did a little half book in between.
So, do you approach writing a bit like sort of Stephen King style, where, he says that's his job, and he won't get out of the chair unless he's written like 1,000 words a day or something like that? Do you give yourself little targets?
Yeah, you have to. For anybody who's a procrastinator and like naturally lazy like I am, you have to set yourself discipline goals. Otherwise, it won't work. And that was the first book I read, Stephen King's On Writing, because it is very informal. There are probably better books about the process of writing and how to do it and develop habits, but Stephen King's is just more of a book that's like, hey, here's my backstory and here's how I think of it. Hopefully it'll help you. And it's a soft introduction, and entertaining. And yeah, he said you have to, whatever your goal is, 500 words, 5,000 words, whatever you can do, set it and do not get out of the chair until you're done, because that's how your brain knows, oh, it's work time today.
And because I think it's force of habit. Even if you're right, even if what you end up writing is crap and you end up discarding it, or in the editing process you go, this doesn't work. But I think creativity can be trained as well. Like if you force yourself to sit down every day, just out of the sheer volume that you'll write, something will be good, and then you can just expand on that, isn't it? Whereas if you're just sitting around waiting for inspiration to hit you, that's when it takes you 5 years between
the absolute worst thing is a blank page. Like they, the old saying is everybody's a critic, and it's totally true. Everybody is a critic, even for your own stuff. And so you're a better critic than you are a writer. 100% of the time you are. And so if you've written something terrible, it's much easier to go back to your terrible stuff and fix it than it is to start from scratch and from just zero. Better to be at 10% good than at 0% of anything. So yeah, you're exactly right. If you just write, even in cold blood, and just get something on the page, maybe tomorrow you'll come back and say, wow, that was garbage, but you'll have something to work on. You're not just staring at a white screen.
Although, how hard did you find it to discard a piece of your writing? Say you've written yourself into a corner. You are however many words or pages in. How hard is it to go, you know what, this is just not working, and rather than try to write myself out of it, I should just go back. I mean, how do you deal with that?
Again, the lazy procrastinator way, work smarter, not harder. Usually I consider those kind of a gift, like a creative gift. So if I have fallen into the sunk cost fallacy and I'm like, nope, keep going, I've invested too much time in this, I need to keep pushing even if it's bad, then usually what I'll do is I'll take that bad thing and I'll selectively cut out all the pieces that definitely don't work, and then splice in things that make it work for the rest of the story. And then what I end up with, most of the time, it doesn't always happen, but most of the time I end up with this really weird chapter that nobody, including me, expected to happen, because it's not linear. It happened in multiple pieces, and so when you have the experience of reading it, you're like, whoa, this is taking some weird zigzags. Well, because it happened in zigzags. It started with two straight lines, and then I pieced them together, and so the scene ends up frenetic and fun, and changing venues a lot, and snappy dialogue, because sometimes it's a Frankenstein of what I originally intended, and I came out with something better in the end. So, but I do not recommend. That's advanced tactics. I do not recommend start writing that way. That's bad advice.
And then, sorry, since you mentioned that, so own up. How many times have you cracked yourself laughing with something you have written?
Oh man, I love to play like the humble guy. I'm like, oh, thank you, no, thank you. But that's part of why I love narrating it so much. Is I'll be in the booth and I'll start laughing at a line and be like, Josh, you got it this time. That's a good one. And if I could, someday I'll probably have to take a sample of all those recorded sessions when I'm typing on the keyboard in the booth to change a joke and be like, oh no, this will really get people going. Because it's ridiculous, and if I'm not having fun with it, then how do I expect anyone else to have fun with it?
Paromita, you had a question?
I did, and then I thought of another one. Okay, I'll go with the first one because it was related to what Steve was asking about narration. And I was a bit embarrassed at first because it's again related to Gaiman. But then you're like, I love Neil Gaiman. So I'm like, yes, okay, then it's probably fine. So this is something that I heard one of my favorite authors, Patrick Rothfuss, say on a stream, and I agree with him. He says that there is this cadence in Neil Gaiman's prose, which is just magical. Like he just gets cadence right. Yeah. It's listening to it is a beautiful experience.
It really is.
And it comes through, I'm guessing, in the narration as well. what I do is I read the text and then I read it in my head and I'm like, da da da, beautiful. Like it was at a height at the ocean of the end of the lane for me. I wanted to ask, is cadence important to you? And do you make that a part of your narration when you're narrating the books? So is it important in writing, and also is it instrumental in your narration process?
Yeah, it is, because everybody has their own voice, right? When you write, everybody, and part of learning how to write is finding your voice. And for me, it's inextricable from the way I talk naturally, the way I narrate. And so as I'm writing, I'm narrating it at the same time. And I don't know, but I suspect Neil Gaiman, as somebody who narrates his own work, I suspect he does something similar, where as he's writing it, he's imagining how he wants to narrate it. And you almost can't get away from that, knowing that you're going to be in the booth speaking these lines. You have to make it sound natural coming out of your mouth. If there's a phrase that you would never say and you don't know how to get your mouth around, you're going to change it. And that's part of making things sound natural. Like dialogue especially is like the bane of a lot of writers' existence, just getting natural, flowing sounding dialogue. And one of the best ways to do it is just to read it aloud to yourself. Whether you're going to narrate it or not, read it out loud. And if it sounds weird to you, it probably is weird. So maybe give it a little tweak. And that's, I think, at least for me, how you get a good rhythm and a little bit of poetry in the prose, so that it sounds nice and you can kind of lull people into the story. And Neil Gaiman is an absolute master at that. I'm only ever emulating, a shadow of what that guy can do.
Yeah, I have to be honest here. I don't know, I may be making everyone jealous, but I had the pleasure of attending the presentation of his book on Norse mythology in London, and he read a chapter. And man, that guy could read the telephone listings and it would sound awesome. He just got his voice and his prose and everything, which is fantastic. Like it was a shame that he only read one chapter.
And the thing is if you look at what makes a narrator really good, Neil Gaiman doesn't check really any of the boxes except having a pleasant voice to listen to. But he just has his own brand. He has his own style, and it just works so well. It would be almost impossible for anybody to emulate his exact style. Kind of like Stephen Fry. He's another really good one that has his own brand, and nobody can duplicate him unless you're copying his voice for AI or something, I guess. But that's a totally different podcast.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask something else, which Jose was talking about, and then you talked about it as well, Mr. Erikson. So, first of all, a book a month, what sorcery is this? For some authors, I am Patrick Rothfuss, Susanna Clarke, George R.R. Martin, Neil Gaiman reader. We do not get books, and we just reread the old books.
Yeah.
What is this sorcery of releasing new books?
I know.
But to actually ask a more reasonable question, what is that balance for you, where you know that a book is done and you are ready to release it into the world, or whether it needs more revisions, it needs more polishing? I was always told during one of my studies that done is better than perfect. And there are a lot of people who would disagree. They would say that, no, you keep revising, and you keep trying to reach that limit of perfection. So as an author, how do you tell yourself, and also maybe as a narrator, when you're in the booth and you're doing the recordings, when do you know that it's time to let go and it's done?
Yeah, I think I actually have it kind of. I've one benefit of the narrating my own books in that I get one more edit When I'm in the booth, I can still edit things. I have a keyboard and a mouse in there and a computer screen. And when I am reading through it, that's like my fifth draft, my polish. And I edit almost every chapter I read. But I think, at least for me, this is totally an opinion, at least for me, the people who believe in perfection are people who will never publish a book. Maybe like Harper Lee, people who publish one book and then that's just their masterpiece and then they're done. Anybody else, if you want to be a working author, you have to learn how to be good with, 95% or so. Because that's all you're ever going to achieve. There will always be, I could go back to every one of my books and completely rewrite them from the ground up, and they'd be better, but is that a good use of my time? And you have to eventually just tell yourself, I'm still having fun with this on my 5 millionth read through, and so that means it is fun, at least to people like me, and now it's time to let go. It's graduated high school. It's time to send it off to college and time to say goodbye. And it's just more of a intuition, I think. I don't think there's a hard and fast rule, but you're right. It's done is better than perfection as long as you know when done is.
Thank you so much.
How did you go about the editing process? Have you got an editor? Have you got someone that checks over for consistency and grammar, spelling, all that kind of stuff?
Yeah. I have an editor named Steph. She's awesome. She lives in Bristol, I think, over on that side of the pond. And she was actually my first review. I submitted books to her, to several people, and she responded, and she was really great. And she was a total stranger and responded back to me and put a review on there that just was unbelievable. And it was my first review from a stranger, and it was 5 stars, and she loved it so much. And I am not ashamed to say that I cried like a little baby, because you put all this work into something, and you're in isolation, you don't know how good it is, and then a stranger tells you, hey, it's pretty good. And that's a big moment. And so then, later I approached her to be a beta reader and then editor, and she's awesome. But luckily, I really enjoy the editing process. I love going back through and tweaking things, and I'll do 3 or 4 drafts, usually 2 drafts. The first draft is never fit for human consumption. It's nobody should see the first draft. That's one of the things. I have authors email me occasionally and say, I finished my book, what should I do now? And I say, you should get yourself a pizza and whatever beverage you want, and then close your door again and do another draft. And the tendency is to want to get it out because you're done and it's so exciting. But the first draft is never your best work. And so the second draft is after the second draft is when I send it to my editor, and then I do a third draft to make it nice and address her feedback, and then a polish, and then, like I said, usually in the booth I have that 5th extra, wax polish to get it really shiny. And then once it's done, I've recorded it, and it is a big hassle to go back and re-record it. So it's done. I don't care if I want to change something. It's over.
Yeah, I can't remember which author it was. Someone that said that once you finish your first draft, you should stick it in a drawer and leave it there for 2 years, and then come back to it.
Yeah,
and
that's advice from the age when writers could live in a lighthouse on the sea coast and write one book every 10 years. But you should let a draft cool down a little bit. Absolutely, you should take a week or 2 off, give it some time, work on something different, and then come back to it.
Conversations that I had with other authors, people that are sort of getting started, like, how did you manage the whole publicity thing. Obviously, you're here tonight, but sometimes I think authors need to be backpackers.
Yeah.
You need to be willing to load your trunk with a box of your books and go to conventions, fairs, and peddle your wares, so to speak. How do you put on that marketing cap on and get out there?
Yeah, that is a different answer for everybody, I think, because there's now, fortunately, we live in just a time when you have a bunch of options. It used to be that conventions were the way, or print ads, were the way, and now you have social media. TikTok is a creature unto itself. If you can get some viral TikTok, you don't have to spend a dime, but you have to do it every day, 5 times a day, and you're putting a lot of sweat equity into that. There's Facebook ads, there's Amazon ads. I think the most important thing is just not put all your eggs in one basket and say yes, because people who ask you questions, like you guys asked me to be here today, and anybody who asks you to do something are book lovers who are cool people who just want to talk about books. And so say yes to that stuff, because you're going to meet nice people, and at the same time, maybe get the word out a little bit. But really the main thing is just treat it like a job. You just have to, you can't be too thin-skinned about it, because as soon as you put your books out there and start marketing them, you're going to get bad reviews, and you're opening yourself up to criticism. So you have to overcome that fear of people criticizing you. And then after that, it's just a little of everything. Just make sure you're visible. Make sure people know your name. Reddit is great,
But have you sort of moved around conventions? Have you gone to book fairs and put up your stall and your table and been there?
I've done a couple.
You're sticking to social media?
Yeah, I've mostly existed online. I've done a couple conventions, but the conventions are almost a totally different animal. Conventions are a lot more about flash and like how big your banner is, and are you wearing a cool like topical cosplay, and are you approachable, and do you have cool tchotchkes sitting out on the table that people can grab? And so it's a big investment. You have to put a lot of money and time and thought into it, and planning. And that's really my biggest hurdle, is if I want to do a convention in next May, I need to book it today and plan to be there and schedule it out. And I'm not good at that. That is not my strong suit. But, if I ever get popular enough and people want to invite me to conventions, I will absolutely come and do panels.
Yeah. There's always that. With reviews, it seems like everyone's, I don't know, it seems like everyone's a little too touchy about reviews and what the different spaces are. And there's some people who think authors should never respond at all to review.
I know.
Some people think it's okay for a positive review, but for a negative review, you shouldn't respond at all. What are your thoughts? How do you handle reviews in general?
Yeah, I've made so many mistakes, and you really don't know until there's no handbook really for this kind of stuff. Well, no, there probably is a handbook, probably available on Amazon right now, for all of these things if you want to go look. Yeah. But I have never read any of the handbooks. So I think, just as a best practice, responding to reviews in general is not a great idea, because places like Goodreads are not for authors. As much as Goodreads would love for them to be, they're for readers. They're for, I take off my author hat and put on my reader hat when I go to Goodreads. And it's for readers to talk to other readers about the books. Once the author gets in there, there's a weirder dynamic where people feel bad about giving a negative review, even if it's truthful. Or, sometimes they want to go after an author for maybe not releasing on time or killing off a loved character, or things like that. And then it just becomes this weird dynamic. And I would much rather talk to people individually, one-on-one. I have some Facebook ads that are doing decently well. And in those comments, that's my space. And so if people leave comments, I absolutely respond to those and interact, because that's the expectation. But if I'm going out and seeking out reviews to comment on them, it's just almost never going to work out well. Once in a while, a reader may say, "Thank you, that's awesome, I love that you responded." But 9 times out of 10, that person left it for their friends, not really for the author to come peek over the fence and get sad about it. I do read them. I read them all, and then I just cry privately to myself. Those are for me to experience alone.
Yeah, there must be a handbook somewhere. I just think if I were an author, if someone left a negative review, I would want to know, like, okay, wait, what is it that didn't work for you? Or I mean, they get a little bit more like feedback.
Yeah.
But I think some people would frown upon that and be like, you need to leave the reader alone. So it's such a weird, everyone has a different opinion on what the interaction should or shouldn't be.
Yeah, my advice to not respond, it comes more from a place of like preserving your own your author brand and like perception, because no matter how well you phrase it, I mean, you could be the best writer in the world, and everybody's going to take your comment just a little bit differently. They read it in their own head. So if you say something like, "Oh, I'm so sorry it didn't work for you. What could I have done better?" They may read it in their head, "Well, I'm so sorry it didn't work for you. What could I have done better?"
Yeah.
And so no matter what you do, it's not going to come off the way you intend it, and it's just better just to not. There are, get beta readers, and invite people for that kind of feedback. And then the expectation is that they will get your questions and answer them. And that's the space for that kind of interaction, I think.
I was also going to make a point, Steve, that, I made this point in another Friday conversation. 70 to 75% of the authors that I read are dead. And how is poor Grandpa Tolkien going to respond when someone leaves a 1-star review for him? So
Boy,
why should the alive authors get opportunity that the dead ones don't? Equal opportunity for all authors.
Yeah, if Tolkien does respond,
their heartbeat status.
That's incredible. I think Goodreads would welcome Tolkien if he was able to respond to all his reviews.
I mean, he has this interview on YouTube where he's like, he speaks for a little bit, and then he's like, "I'm a meticulous kind of bloke." And I'm like, this is the understatement of the millennium. Not the century, but the millennium.
And I also wonder about like social media. I know an author who went viral on TikTok, and they sold a lot of books, and it was all the rage for about 2 weeks, and they felt really great, and they're like, "I'm gonna finish my next book that I'm working on. I want to get it out. I want to capitalize." And crickets.
Yeah, I know.
They almost fell into a depression after that, because it moves so fast that yes, you can go viral, and you can be successful, but then you kind of come back down to earth because someone else is going viral, and someone else is the big, the popular book of the week or whatever. So how do you kind of manage that? How would you manage that?
Yeah, that happened to me. Not with TikTok, but my last name is Erikson. And Steven Erikson is incredibly popular fantasy author, and his is nom de plume. His is author name. That's not his real name. Mine is real. I was born with it, but he spells it exactly the same way. And so when I uploaded my book, this is my little first book that nobody had ever heard of. I was involved in the self-published fantasy blog off with Mark Lawrence, and I had a little bit of play with that, and a couple cool bloggers had read my book, but, it was nothing huge. And I uploaded my book, and the algorithm saw Erikson, and they were like, oh yeah, let's pump this one to the top. And so for a solid month, my book was in the top 5 urban fantasy consistently, and I had no explanation for it. And I was trying to figure out, how did I do this? And I thought maybe this is just what happens when you upload a book. It just becomes immediately popular and and takes no work from you. And so I right away started to write the second book and get it out, and then slowly but surely everybody figured out that I was not Stephen Erikson's son. I'm just some other guy who has that name. And so my sales leveled out more to where they probably should have been. And so I had to learn how to have more sustainable marketing practices like ads and social media and developing a fan base and things like that. And TikTok is just 10 times worse because it is very much flavor of the day, whatever's trending. And so if your book stops trending after a week, the algorithm just drops you, and there's nothing that you can even do except start a new account and hope lightning strikes twice. So the best thing to do is to capitalize with paid ads and with social media and get people while you have their attention, your 15 minutes of fame.
But surely TikTok is not where you're going to find your audience.
Yeah.
The kind of people that will plow through a 500, 600, 700 page book one of a fantasy series are not the kind of people that are scrolling through 10-second TikToks. I mean, I've got a lot of issues with social media, and TikTok is just, to me, is just the biggest devil out there today.
I don't want to disparage TikTok, because if somebody wants to make my videos go viral, I'll take it. But you're right. I mean, TikTok is more about, I think, the experience and being part of the community. And so when a book does go viral, people are more excited to get the book in their hands and then make their own video and then talk about the book and be a part of the moment. Kind of like the Barbie movie. Everybody wants to dress up in pink and go see the Barbie movie for those few weeks that it was the flavor. And then it moves on and then it's done. And that's really not who generally... absolutely buy my books, but generally that's not the kind of fan that reads fantasy. Fantasy fans tend to be a little less about flavor of the day and more about what are this author's, why should I care about this world, and what's the hook, and how much good world building am I getting for my time and my money. So you're right. Fantasy is not a big genre. Urban fantasy either. On things like TikTok, it's more about finding the more thoughtful, I guess, readers. And there's not really a platform for that, social media wise. So word of mouth is really powerful. Reddit, our fantasy, is really powerful for fantasy.
Right.
I wanted to ask a bit about your books, Mr. Erikson, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So, again, I've only read the first volume of Dresden Files and the first volume of Rivers of London. So, I'm not sure whether how exactly it goes, but I believe it gradually develops into bigger and bigger arcs, so that while book one can be read on its own, maybe book 5 or 6, you would have to read the previous ones and so on and so forth. When you started writing your series, was it more episodic, or is it a story? Is it one story told in many parts?
So, both things are true in this one for my series, because I hate cliffhangers. To me, it's such a cheap ploy to put a cliffhanger at the end of a book and make people read the next book. I mean, they sell way more books than I do, probably, but I just don't like it. And so I make each book, it has a satisfying resolution at the end. So if you want to bail at the end of that book, you can, and you will have had a satisfying story. And that's just a personal preference for me. Cliffhangers aren't inherently bad. I just personally don't like them. But they're also not episodic, because they have a pretty substantial arc behind them that starts right away in book one. And I originally planned it as a 10-book series, and so I'm getting close to about halfway through now, and it just keeps going. So for me, that's the best marriage of getting somebody to go on to the next book, but also not trapping them into reading the next one.
I wanted to ask a bit, in fantasy we have different approaches by authors. So one is, though yours is not exactly the same, but one is where people they create a particular secondary world, and they write only in that world for many, many volumes. We can say Malazan or Wheel of Time or Sanderson's Cosmere. And the other one is, again, I think this is going to be a recurring theme. Maybe we can title this the Gaiman episode, where I think for Neil Gaiman, the question, am I going to like a Neil Gaiman novel? One has to try each one and see, because he can dabble with whatever he likes, and somehow it works for so many readers. So I wanted to ask, urban fantasy sort of, maybe it gives you a little bit of that leeway to dabble in both. So you have this world and you have this setting and these characters, this cast perhaps whom we are connected to, but also you can explore different mythologies or maybe different histories. So maybe just a bit your thoughts on that.
Yeah. I kind of went for the best of both worlds scenario on that one, because some urban fantasies take themselves really seriously and really try to stick to some hard magical rules, and I don't really mess around with that. My books are a little more ridiculous, and so I can have them going to a real world location or to just a different plane of existence, and then that allows you to really play with kind of the trope expectations, like the genre expectations, where you can do things that normally wouldn't occur in an urban fantasy, and have settings that normally wouldn't occur, in a city, and then that way you get to play in those worlds too. You can kind of have both. So yeah, I think most urban fantasy likes to stick to the expectations and the tropes because it sells the best, but I just write whatever feels fun at the time.
Was the choice of...
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. No, go ahead, Paromita.
I was going to say it's very inspiring to hear from authors that, it is possible to write to market, but ultimately in terms of longevity or in terms of being able to sustain literary tradition, it is more important to follow one's vision. It's, I guess it's inspirational for me because it's not just restricted to writing, but to, in general, anything. So just thank you for that message.
Yeah, no, I think that people who write to market are totally valid. It's a smart idea. It's a good strategy to be able to make a living as an author if you study the trends and you write to that. But it's not like mentally, emotionally sustainable for me if I don't love what I'm doing while I'm doing it. And I think, I don't know, but I suspect that you can do it for longer if you're genuinely in love with the story you're writing, and it's not just, the tropes you read about. And that's just a personal thing. But yeah, it is possible. You can build a career on doing the thing you love. Sometimes it's harder, and sometimes it takes longer to convince people to, take a look. But, it's possible.
I was just going to ask about your choice of your setting being the real world, because increasingly there is less fantasy in fantasy, and people like Joe Abercrombie, people like Scott Lynch, even though they're writing fantasy, it's very obvious that their world setting, it is just our world where all they're doing is changing the name of places. Abercrombie, it is very much Middle Ages England and the Scandinavian countries, and Scott Lynch, same story. So what was your thought process to decide to stick to real world Lincoln, Nebraska, as opposed to call it Townsville in whatever and still be Lincoln, Nebraska in everything but name?
Yeah, I think that goes back to kind of having the pros and cons. When you have a secondary world, you can fudge some of the history details. You can set it in what is effectively 15th century England or whatever you want to do. And then you can fudge some of the historical details, and you always have the out of, hey, this is a fantasy. Just because I didn't exactly follow, this is a fantasy that I'm making up. And so they're getting the benefit of having all that to draw from, where you can just look up in a history book and say, oh yeah, War of the Roses. Okay, I can pull some things from this and use that as inspiration. But then they get to play with the magic. To me, it came down more to having that foundation of the existing world. And so as a new writer, just starting out, I didn't have to burden myself with the additional responsibility of also creating an entire history. Because it's really important to me to get that right. If I'm going to do that, if I'm going to build a mythology or a history or a pantheon of gods, I have to know everything about them. Even if I'm only putting the top 10% of those details in the book, I need to be an expert on that subject, which is a lot of time. And so not only am I learning how to write for the first time and learning how to market my books for the first time, but I'm also, developing an elven language or whatever. I'm trying to be Tolkien because I just demand that of myself. And so to lay off the stress a little bit, putting it in a modern world made it so I could just be free to play inside the world rather than having to build it from the ground up.
But isn't that an unnecessary pressure, the belief that to create a secondary world because I think people sometimes forget who Tolkien was as a person. First and foremost, he was an Oxford scholar who translated the great Viking sagas into English before writing Lord of the Rings. He wasn't someone that went to university to study creative writing and then gave it a shot. He was a proper university professor in one of the most prestigious humanities universities in the world. So I think, with all due respect, a lot of people pale in comparison to Tolkien.
No, you're exactly right. It is a completely unrealistic, unreasonable expectation to have for yourself as an author to try and do any of that. And I can't get past it just on a personal level. I feel, for me, I feel a responsibility to know the answer to those questions. There's so Gary Larson does the Farside comics, and he had this thing called cow tools in one of the comics. And it's this idea that if you put these weird shapes on the table and then one hand saw, people will assume all those weird shapes are also tools that have real functions, right? because there's a handsaw there. And for some reason, all those other tools that he just labeled cow tools, they must do something. And so usually the author trick is to name one real thing, one real color, viridian or something. And then you can say like Orleans dew. And people will assume that must be a color. I have no idea what it is, but it sounds awesome. It's got to be a color because the first one he said is a real color. Or like the Star Trek does that too, where they'll name, Mozart, Beethoven, and then Glibson 5. It gives it credibility. And so you can absolutely use that trick, and you should use that trick in your book. Rather than building out an entire history, use a few things that have truth, and then use some cow tools in the background to make it seem bigger than it actually is. I just personally am a perfectionist, and so what happens to me is I'll start writing those cow tools, and then I'll be like, wait a minute, but what are they really? and then I fall down a rabbit hole. So it's just knowing my own limitations and working around them.
Paromita, do you have a question?
I do. I was thinking a bit about what you said in the beginning, Mr. Erikson, that you love to talk about books. And I thought of another thing that you said, where you said that I exclusively don my reader hat when I go into Goodreads. I try to don my reader hat. So I sort of thought I will ask one question for your author hat and one question for your reader hat. So the question for your author hat is, you mentioned some of your favorite works like Lord of the Rings, A Song of Ice and Fire, American Gods, The Prophet by Khalil Gibran, which I also love a lot. Is there a work or maybe some works which you as an author, you read or you remember reading, which made you feel, I'm never going to be able to write like that. This is majestic.
Yeah.
This is far beyond. And then I will ask the question for the reader hat. But first, this question.
Yeah, my answer to that is, maybe some people will think it's weird, but I don't think it's weird, and it's Terry Pratchett. I have never read anybody who can sound so silly and be so smart at the same time. And you read the book on the surface and you go, this is a funny story. And then he'll catch you and say something so unbelievably profound from in the voice of a golem or something, or a dwarf, that is just a casual mention. The popular meme about buying cheap boots, right? That's from Terry Pratchett, where cheap boots are more expensive than expensive boots, and that's like the illustration of poverty. And he can do that all day long. Every one of his books has that in it. And yet, when people think of him, he's a funny guy who is, just writes fun books, little tiny, thin little books. And I will never, ever, nobody is ever going to come close to what that guy could do.
Isn't he the most he's in the UK, he's probably the most beloved writer ever. I think the BBC did a poll of the 100 best novels of all time, and him and Dickens are the same amount of novels there. He's on that level. But I think outside of that, generally he's underappreciated or underrated, and I suffered from that because I saw those book covers when I first moved to the UK. I was like, no, I take my fantasy seriously. This is not for me. And then I fell down the Discworld rabbit hole, and I think it is one of the gems of the fantasy.
The
literature.
first book, Color of Magic, is maybe where the problem is, because he wrote it more to market, and then once he was able to cut loose and be himself, that's when the books really take off. And so Color of Magic, probably isn't the best place to start, but if you start with Mort or something, boy, he's just incredible. So as an author, that's the one that I read that and I say, it doesn't matter. I'll never be able to achieve that.
Never use a footnote.
Yeah, exactly.
Should I ask the question for the reader hat now?
Oh,
Go on, sorry.
boy, it's probably the same answer because
No, it's probably, it might be the same answer, but I was going to say, I mean, this is, and I'm responsible for this partly, is that we spent quite a bit of time talking about pigeonholing books into genres, and a lot of it is helpful for booksellers and for readers like us. We like a book like this, the genre label helps us. But I was going to ask, as a reader, have you ever read a book, especially if it's speculative fiction in science fiction or fantasy or a series or anything within SFS, that made you wish, I mean, this is far beyond any genre label. This is universal world literature. This is above any kind of pigeonholing.
Yeah. That one, maybe American Gods for me for that one. I remember reading it, and I had never heard of Neil Gaiman before that. And I texted my friends and said, they might, if it weren't for some of the content, they could teach this in literature classes. It's just the story is constructed so beautifully. But it is urban fantasy. It is, I think it unfairly gets labeled as just urban fantasy because I think it says more profound things about faith and belief and like the human condition than it gets credit for. And I think it's one of those that could be mainstream. You know, it is mainstream with the Showtime series and everything, but as a book, it could be on everybody's shelf. As long as you're down with, you know, some kind of crazy, gory stuff sometimes.
I was just about to say incomprehensible stuff.
Yeah. I mean, you have to be okay with stuff. Getting your mind blown a little bit occasionally and getting grossed out, but that's part of life sometimes. So, at least for me, I'm sure there's way better answers to that question, but that's the first one that popped in my head.
Thank you. With your permission, I would like to ask the other panelists, please, with your reader hat, is there a book or series that you have read in fantasy or science fiction which is above any kind of genre label, which is just it's just great literature for you? Steve and Jose, maybe.
Go ahead, Jose.
Oh, I think we've touched on it. I think Josh almost made me tear up when he mentioned Discworld. I think Discworld is such a unique thing. It's like nothing I've read before, and I think it would be like nothing I will ever read again, because as soon as someone tries to do it, it's gonna go, oh, you're trying to pull a Pratchett here. He was so unique, and he had a deep knowledge of the fantasy tropes and the fantasy genre, and he subverted them all. You thought that you were going with the boy that would be king from a humble origin, and he rejects the crown and he decides to remain a city watchman, isn't it? And he did that throughout, Monstrous Regiment, the woman pretending to be a man. We've seen that in movies, we've seen that in theater plays. Turns out every single person in that regiment was a woman pretending to be a man, and no one knew. And it's just, no one can ever repeat something like that. Everyone else, they write fantasy, they write within the relative confines of the genre, but something so unique and so special, I don't think I'll ever read something like that again. I wish I could read it all again for the first time.
You guys are making me want to read Discworld over here.
Oh man, it's so good.
Maybe I'll have to start it. I already have, what was the book you mentioned earlier? What said the...
Color of Magic?
No, what was the book? Department of Truth. I already have that on
yeah.
Bad influence. I can't really think of anything that really stood out. I think the only thing that comes to mind is maybe, I don't know, Paromita is not a fan, but the second Apocalypse is the only thing I think of. Maybe maybe that, but I'm not sure that I've read anything that stands out too much. But that's the only thing that comes to mind.
I guess I could say, but maybe I don't know if it's fantasy, but the whole H.P. Lovecraft thing, you know, everything. He created something so unique and so different from what was the horror genre at the time. He just took horror in a brand new direction, and so many people have added to it, have developed it, have built on it. You talk about cornerstones of writing. You got Lovecraft, Tolkien, Pratchett.
Yeah, definitely. So, Josh, I know I promised you not to hit you with any hard questions, but it's I have to ask, since you're a fan of A Song of Ice and Fire, will that series ever be finished?
Oh man,
in your opinion?
I mean, I can't imagine how much pressure he and like Patrick Rothfuss are under with just the curse of success on those. There's just no one human being could come up with a satisfying ending to either of those series anymore. It's just every fan theory has been explored, and just there's already a lot of pressure to be creative, you know, and to come up with something interesting and fun. And when you're under the radar, like I sell reasonably well. It's not, you know, but I'm nowhere near a household name. So I still have a lot of freedom to go wherever I want with the story. But George R. R. Martin and Rothfuss, they're absolutely painted into the most ridiculous corner, because there's just nowhere they could go that will be satisfying, and they both know it because they're both smart people. So I can't imagine how they would ever finish it unless they write it, put it in a safe, and say, on the day I die, you can release this, and then nobody can criticize me.
I know Jose has opinions on that one.
I totally disagree with that. I think, because George Martin has said it himself, that if people guess where your story is going, it's not because your writing is bad. It's because you've done a good job of planting the seeds and dropping the hits and foreshadowing where the story is going. I don't think his issue is that he doesn't. I don't think the issue is people have figured out where the story is going, therefore he needs to surprise us with something unexpected. I don't think that's the problem. I think the problem is he's made a lot of money late in life, and he's just like a kid in the toy shop.
Yeah.
He bought his own cinema, he bought his own train track with a train. He's now he's the Game of Thrones businessman with all the TV shows and everything. And he's just enjoying the success and become a businessman. He's not a writer anymore. I think that's his problem. It's not anything to do with the writing. He knows where the story is going. When he initially pitched it, it was a 3-book series. He knew who was going to survive and die at the end and everything. And he cannot have diverged that much from the original story. It is totally money and success and all the distractions that he's got going in his life.
Yeah, I can definitely see that, because there is a lot to having the hunger, you know, to saying, not only do I want to write this story, but I need to, because I need to buy groceries, you know, 6 months from now when this is supposed to be released. And so there is a lot to be said for becoming so financially successful so quickly. The motivation to become a successful writer is gone because you did it. Congratulations. But just from my perspective, staring down at a blank page into the 4th book, there is a feeling of like, what else can I do to surprise people? And nobody's really online talking about my books, so I've got a lot of options. But I think maybe less for George R. R. Martin. I think you're probably right with George R. R. Martin. It's a money situation, and he's just doesn't have the drive anymore. The story's technically finished with the TV show, however you want to say that turned out. But Patrick Rothfuss, I want to say in his case, it's more that he holds himself to a too high a standard, and it's easier to go do, D&D groups and charity work and things like that, because that's tangible stuff that he can get done today. But when you look at the book and you know that it can't be perfect as everybody wants it to be, there's no way you can achieve that, that is debilitating, man. That will wreck you. So that's just, from my side.
Steve, you have to permit me a long monologue now.
Oh, go for it.
So, first of all, for point number one, huge Killer fan. Moderate usually is a Fire fan. King Killer fan to the extent I check the King Killer edit every week. So, second, I'm on high grade hopium and copium, which will be illustrated by me right now. I believe winter is coming, and I believe we will find out what is behind the doors of stone. And my prediction for winter right now is 2024, and my prediction for no laughing, it can still happen. And my prediction for doors of stone is end of 2024, 2025. So, one thing which I sort of was I'm sad about it. I've reread these books a lot of times, especially King Killer. For me, I don't know, maybe because we all have struggled with things in our lives. I feel that each individual, whether they're an author or not, nobody really knows what one person is going through. Even the people closest to them. And then, if they have a public persona and their public persona is for all to see, who knows what is actually going on behind the scenes. And this goes for every person. Even Mr. Erikson, you are a public persona, but nobody actually knows what happens in that creative process. That is between you and the paper, as you said. That is an intensely isolating and a very personal process. And though we might express interest, we might express curiosity, we might express reverence, but I don't think we can ever express 100% true understanding as just a reader. So for me, I'm at that point where I choose to believe that these authors, Mr. Rothfuss and Mr. Martin, will try their best to complete their magnum opus, because ultimately it is about the sustaining power of literature. They do have something special out there. There are lots of people who love it. I believe that if the next installment comes out, there are a lot of people who will say, all is forgiven, let us try it. So I want to sort of cling on to hope. And I fully, if you all tell me that I'm on copium, Paromita, this is sad. I admit to that, but I sort of want to believe in them, and because of the worlds and the words they have given me. So that's my monologue. Thank you.
I do wonder. I do wonder if they received Martin's notes for the last season and a half of Game of Thrones, and he saw the reaction to it, and he's like, I don't know. Maybe this is what I was going to do, but maybe I should rethink this. I wonder if he was like, back to the drawing board.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, Steve, I don't know whether for you this is true as a reader, though I know you do not like to know anything about a book when you go in. But for me, it is, the what is somewhat boring. The why is always interesting. So, whether the show end and the books end collide or not, I think that the path that we go there, what he says on the way, one thing which is there in Feast of Crows, I don't think it's much of a spoiler. It's not. I will not mention the spoiler part, but there is this character called Brienne who is walking about the land, and every place she is and asking a particular question. And as she's asking this particular question, she is seeing the ravages of war. And when first time I was like, what is happening? When I read it. And the second time when I read it, when one of my friends, the Purple Bookworm, she said, try to think about why the author is doing this. like beyond filling words and making a 1200-page book? Why is the author telling this if it has no plot purpose? If it has no plot purpose, if it has no character purpose, it only can have a theme purpose. And that theme is that, okay, you won your wars, you're engaged in your power battles. Look at what has happened to the common people. So somebody who is still in that headspace in book 4, in book 5, I want to believe that they will bring it back. It is a tremendous, tremendous ask, but I want to keep hope that maybe they will do it.
Yeah, and I think that's part of what goes wrong in those big series. You string out all these tantalizing things, and then you have to try and tie them all together in a satisfying way. And sometimes when you string those things out, it's just because they're neat, not because you intended for them to go anywhere. But then after the fact, you say, oh, I probably should have that go somewhere. And so you're kind of building a railroad as the train is rolling on it, you know? And I'm sure there are people who are much smarter than me and can plan out those thousands of little threads perfectly from the very beginning, but I suspect most people kind of do it after the fact. And there's Neil Gaiman said something, and I'm going to misquote it, but the essence of it is the second draft is the act of making it look like the first draft you knew what you were doing. And so, you know, in the second draft of the book, you go in and say, uh-oh, this guy has a knife in his pocket. I better 5 chapters previously put a knife in his pocket. That way it makes sense for him to have it here. And the same is true for book 5 or 6, where you go back to book 1 and say, oh boy, I strung this thing out. Now I better make it relevant in book 6. And that's a hard thing to do when you better be an expert on your own lore.
It's a lot to keep track of. I just noticed that the time flew. It's
oh, yeah.
Yes. But before we wrap up, Josh, I wanted to ask you something I try and ask all the guests is, what was your first job? And what did you learn from that experience?
Oh, boy. My first job was a paper boy when such a thing existed. My first real job was working at a fast food Mexican restaurant. And I think maybe the thing you learn from any retail or food service job is just that you're not the main character of the world. You know, you very quickly realize that everybody's just the main character of their own story. And when you're working for minimum wage and putting burritos together, you have to come to terms with the fact that, like, you need to make your own life have meaning. Like, nobody's going to hand it to you. If you wake up and expect an old man to come out of a portal and give you a quest, like, you're going to be disappointed, man. And so you have to make it for yourself, whatever that is for you, whatever that means for you. It doesn't mean you have to go out and find an amazing, fulfilling job, but like, find the place in the world that matters to you and make it better and do your best and become that main character in your own story. Like, earn it, because everybody believes that that's who they are. So retail and food service deliver that lesson really quickly when you're a young teenager who's only ever experienced the world from, one place.
I love that. You're not the main character.
Yeah.
You're a side character.
Yeah.
Awesome. I like that. But before we go, can you tell everyone who's listening where they can find you and your work?
Yeah, my website is josherikson.com, JOSHERIKSON.com. And my books are available on Audible and iTunes for audiobooks, and on Amazon for ebooks and paperback.
Awesome. Thank you so much for hanging out with us.
Oh, thank you very much. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah. And Paromita, where can people find you?
I can be found on the Page Chewing Forum. I just want to thank Steve and Jose for letting me part of the panel, and to Mr. Erikson for so graciously answering so many of my questions. Thank you so much.
I told you to look out for her. She's, yeah, good job. And Jose, where can people find you?
Mostly at Jose's Amazing Worlds on YouTube, and then on the Page Chewing forums as well. And of course, Steve, as usual, thank you ever so much for having me on. And Josh, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you tonight.
Yeah, it's been
Yeah,
great.
glad everyone can make it. Yeah. So, and I hope everyone has a great weekend, and we'll see everyone very soon.
Bye.